Go ahead and get started. I'm Joseph Sutkowi. I'm the Chief Waterfront Design Officer at Waterfront Alliance. I lead our Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines program and WEDG standards. I come from a background in ports and infrastructure planning, working with CARP strategies and other firms in the ports and infrastructure world. The webinar today is going to discuss the importance of the maritime industry, provide some insights on the economic significance of shipping and transportation, the challenges and opportunities of the industry, and explore the future of maritime in the region. So thank you for joining the webinar this afternoon. For those who aren't familiar with Waterfront Alliance, we're a US-based nonprofit organization with a growing alliance of more than 1,100 partners that focuses on environmental and economic development, bringing about real change to shorelines, waterfronts, and coastlines across the country, but especially here in New York and New Jersey, where we're based. I'd like to introduce the panelists for today. We have Ray Fusco, who's the owner of Hudson Canyon Consulting, seasoned professional with extensive experience in the maritime industry, waterfront development, and outdoor recreation. His firm is dedicated to enhancing public access to waterfronts and promoting sustainable coastal development. He works very closely with the Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines and a number of Waterfront Alliance initiatives. Matt McInerney is the Workforce Strategic Partnerships lead at the Ready Center, a nonprofit organization based in Brooklyn, New York. Matthew focuses on developing and managing strategic partnerships that enhance workforce development initiatives. He's been heavily involved in the maritime industry. And then Ryan White is the transportation planning lead for Jacobs. He has 15 years of experience in maritime logistics and planning, worked for New York City Economic Development Corporation as a vice president, overseeing maritime freight planning projects, including the city's Marine Highways program. At Jacobs, Ryan leads a team of transportation planners that work on transportation decarbonization, traffic, freight, and public realm improvement projects. We do have, as part of this webinar, a Q&A box. Feel free to drop questions in there. We're gonna, at the end of the webinar, try to get to some of those, and we'll save some time to do that. And then I'll also just share with folks that at the end of the webinar, we will upload this to YouTube. We'll share the link with everyone and some additional resources that can be helpful. So with that kind of context set and the housekeeping taken care of, I want us to start with an overview of the maritime sector, specifically thinking about the New York, New Jersey region. What is the significance and what's the impact to the region? So we're going to have Ray. Why don't you start us off?
Thanks, Joseph, and thanks for everyone who's participating today. From a regional perspective, it's important to keep the ports ranking across the nation in context. We are the second largest port in the nation with the second highest container volume. We have an incredibly strong and robust tug and barge industry. We're the #1 mover of petroleum products in the Northeast and the nation. We have a very robust and diverse passenger vessel market and industry that includes cruise ship industry, tourism boats. We have one of the largest, if not the largest, passenger ferry systems with Staten Island Ferry, NYC Ferry, New York Waterways. All of this is happening within a confined waterway and confined real estate footprint, and it has a significant impact on our region. I think you're on mute, Joseph.
Oh, I think you're, yeah.
I was sorry about that, everyone. I was just kicking it to Ryan to introduce us to a little more of the transportation industry.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Joseph, and obviously Waterfront Alliance for having me today. You know, the maritime sector and industry is obviously critical to the lifeblood of New York and the region. You know, the transportation system of our region is incredibly complicated and complex, and there's many layers to it, and all of them are dependent on each other. As Ray alluded, you know, we are the largest port on the East Coast, and our maritime assets really play an important role in allowing for international trade and a lot of containerized cargo to come to our port. And you know, that really reduces things like vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, which, you know, causes congestion on our highways and pollutes our air. So the maritime community and industry is really important to addressing things like climate change. And it is really a great way to support the economy. And, you know, we in New York City have 520 miles of waterfront coastline that had been used more robustly in the past. And obviously, you know, economies evolve and change, and most of our goods used to be distributed by our through our waterways. And of course, as the interstate system was developed, you know, a lot of that was shifted to trucking. And but, you know, we're moving to a place in which a lot of our highways, as we all know, are increasingly congested, and it's difficult to move goods, and you know, that costs money. So thankfully, our waterways are being looked at again as another avenue of moving not just people, but goods. So I can certainly speak more to that. Thank you.
And Matt, why don't you talk a little bit about kind of the working waterfront aspects
Sure,
of
absolutely.
the industry?
Absolutely, Ryan. Thank you for the good lead in. You know, the economy kind of went away from the waterfront. Waterfront communities became incredibly disinvested, high levels of pollution, high levels of unemployment and poverty. There is a shift back to the waterfront. You know, Ready Center is based on we actually float in the Gowanus Bay. We kind of hear a lot of folks getting very excited about the incredible investment that's coming to our waterfront, you know, specifically in South Brooklyn and North Staten Island. We're hearing a lot of job training that's being provided by the development firms, by the city government. There seems to be an incredible enthusiasm about what's coming and what can be provided to the community.
And I'll just add to this some kind of additional context on the economics of the port industry, and also just the ownership, because I think that's something that's helpful to talk about. So from an economic perspective, here just in New York City, there are about 20,000 direct jobs provided by the maritime and ports industry. It's $6.4 billion in business revenue. It's $1 billion in local and state tax revenue, and another $1 billion to the federal coffers. And these jobs are oftentimes union with the ILA. There's jobs in warehousing. There's jobs in the cruise terminals. This leads to jobs in banking and insurance and operations. Like it's not just, you know, who's actually working out on the port facilities themselves, but all of this other kind of supply chain and maritime infrastructure that's behind that, that then enables us to live on this series of islands on the East Coast. I also want to, you know, the major port operator that's running, the major port landowner that has the container terminals, that has the cruise terminals, largely Port Authority of New York, New Jersey, some New York City Economic Development Corporation in there. But out of the 520 miles of waterfront, Port Authority is about 16 miles of active waterfront. EDC's a little more than that, I believe, but that's not all working waterfront. You also have just across the city smaller operators, smaller facilities that own their own wharves and their own infrastructure. So while we often talk about EDC or port authorities being the main landowners on the waterfront, there's all of these smaller pieces there that then make coordination and ownership and logistics just all the more complicated. I think that, you know, thinking about kind of where things are in the waterfront, how our waterfront has evolved over time is a really important aspect of this conversation. So Ray, I wonder if you could kind of give us a bit of a history lesson of how maritime has evolved in New York City over the past century, and maybe what lessons should we be drawing from there?
I hope you're not inferring that I've been around for a century, Joseph. That would be a bit too much.
2 centuries for you.
Thank you. So I think, as Joseph alluded to, the real estate. At one point, the city of New York, and specifically Manhattan, was ringed with piers. And so the vessel sizes and shapes were very different. They brought different types of cargo in smaller quantities. And it was needed to have a wealth of piers to offload and to move the goods. As time went on and the containerization of cargo happened, we started seeing much higher throughput, and we started seeing a concentration of real estate and footprints where they could process large volumes of cargo, larger vessels. Today, we're still continuing to see the advancements and the increase in size of these vessels. We're looking at, in the Port of New York and New Jersey right now, a deepening to 55 feet to accommodate larger vessels with more containers. That's why they lifted the Bayonne Bridge and a variety of other things. So really there's this concentration. There's been a concentration over the decades of areas, that's 16 miles or so, of places where we had throughput. So there's just been this significant loss of dedicated industrial maritime real estate, and that's where we've seen things go over the last 100 years.
Ryan, could you maybe talk about trucking and competitiveness with freight?
Yeah, sure. So, within sort of supply chains generally, there's always a competition between modes to move, a particular good. Obviously, typically the path of least resistance or the cheapest path is what's chosen by third-party logistics providers, or any companies that are involved in this business are obviously looking to find the method that is the cheapest and the fastest. One of the things that has sort of eaten into the maritime ecosystem has been trucking. As I mentioned, it is incredibly flexible, nimble, and trucks also are operating on a subsidized highway often. Many highways aren't tolled. The maritime industry can be more expensive and is slightly less nimble. So there's this constant sort of competition between the modes. I won't get into rail, which tends to be longer distance, obviously with moving goods across the country. But I think with maritime, we've created such an established center in New York with a lot of good expertise that we should continue to leverage. The industry has been around for so long, and given that just our situation in this beautiful harbor, which is how it was founded in the first place, there's a lot of opportunity to sort of modernize our maritime ecosystem. And I know we'll get into this in a minute, but sort of the idea of more of a hub and spoke system to move goods is really interesting. And when I was working at EDC, we were looking hard at this concept of marine highways, I believe now called blue highways, that can offer some potential solutions to move freight throughout our region to compete with trucking. And again, it's always about the modes competing with each other for that freight. And we can speak more to that, but I think as our roadways continue to be congested and folks are more cognizant of potential air emissions, if we're not transitioning our trucks to EVs, then there could be an even stronger case for marine highways. So yeah, could you speak more to that?
And Matt, you have kind of an interesting family background in the maritime space. I wonder if you could kind of tie that into this conversation.
Absolutely. So yeah, my great-great-grandfather was actually a bricklayer on the Brooklyn Bridge, lived in Gowanus, waterfront person, waterfront job. His son worked for Brooklyn Citizen Gas, which was the precursor to Keystone, which was the precursor to National Grid. And then my paternal grandfather worked at Con Edison, mostly on the 14th Street energy generator, but also Ravenswood and other waterfront. So that's 3 generations of family that created economic mobility because of the New York waterfront, particularly South Brooklyn, but really, across the 520 miles. That is a concern that I am hearing from, I said there's a lot of enthusiasm coming from the community. There's also a little bit of skepticism that are these jobs going to be filled by people who live on the waterfront. And, my family's a great example of there's really no better way for economic mobility than working in your community on an infrastructure project. I think that there is, some level of skepticism. The folks in Red Hook, Sunset Park, they've heard about community development. They've heard about economic development for generations. And sometimes when they hear that, they hear displacement. I think that there really does need to be a high focus with this modernization of ports, that the jobs are going to the people who already live there.
And I think just on the history piece, there's kind of two other things that are worth bringing up here, and that's going to be the first is the migration of people back to the water. So if we think about pre-Clean Water Act 1972, a waterfront literally stunk. Like this is not a place you wanted to be. It was for industry, and there was kind of no competition for industry except other industry there. And now you have this drive for people to want to be on the waterfront, and that's making it so that we do have very limited working waterfront space left. The larger port facilities, the container operation stuff have primarily moved to New Jersey. We still have Brooklyn Marine Terminal, of course, a Red Hook Container Terminal, and then Howland Hook Marine Terminal on Staten Island, still both important container operations, but the really large facilities are in New Jersey. The pressure on waterfront real estate doesn't allow for that kind of space to open up on in New York City. Where we do have that is being in the process of being utilized is with South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, the offshore wind facility. Offshore wind is now now rapidly growing, possibly paused a little bit after last week, but there's a lot of nuance there. A rapidly growing industry that's taking up a new waterfront space. We'll have both large facilities like South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, but also smaller ones that can fit in other neighborhoods in whether it's Navy Yard, Brooklyn Marine Terminal, or Ravenswood, where you have maritime operations and this new industry coming in, which we haven't seen in a long time. I'm curious kind of what you guys see is the biggest challenges facing the maritime sector. I started talking about the real estate challenge being one of them there. Others feel free to expand on that. But Ryan, why don't you start off for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the challenges has been just the sort of I don't want to use the word encroachment, but in some ways that is what is happening to a lot of our more maritime industrial areas, which limits obviously the use of those sites. And so, as New Yorkers or folks in New Jersey gravitate towards the water, which is great, it does come at a cost. And I think preserving a lot of those waterfront sites has been really important. It hasn't happened in all locations, but it's happened in some. You mentioned SBMT, for which Jacobs were actually involved in helping to design that facility, which we're very excited about. And that's a good example of preserving, that industrial character in Sunset Park. And I can't remember, I think it was maybe Ray or maybe you, Joseph, mentioning the tug and barge industry, which is so important to the larger ecosystem. And a lot of that's on Staten Island. And thankfully that has been preserved. The city does have industrial business zones. Some of those are more inland. So I think it's certainly the sort of tension between who's getting access to the waterfront. And I think one of those solutions potentially in the future is just trying to have, flexible multi-use sites that aren't just, for a particular use type or constituency. I think it's important to have spaces that are flexible and can be used for different things at different times of the day. So I think that's one of the main challenges. It's just the sort of encroachment of space.
I think it's interesting that you use the word preserve, because one of the things that kind of we see as a challenge is that our waterfront infrastructure tends to be in really bad shape. And a lot of it's 50 to 70 years old. We have marine borers, which are little worms and bugs that can eat out the timber piles or timber posts, if you will, that hold up most of the in-water structures. We have a lot of our waterfront that's starting to or close to collapse. So when you are thinking about these flexible spaces and even something like SBMT, where you need to kind of do the really significant upgrades to waterfront facilities, just given age and the marine borer issue that's so prevalent. Matt, kind of from thinking about your hat in the workforce world, what do you see as some of the big challenges?
Well, aside from our ports aging, the workforce is also aging on the waterfront. It's a legacy job historically, the folks that work there, and there's sort of a legacy barrier that needs to be broken as well. Getting into, there's a lot of union work on there. Getting into those unions we found to be very, very challenging. I think that there's a lot of education and information that needs to be trickled down from developers, higher education, community organizations, the government, that needs to sort of communicate to the community, to people looking for jobs, what those jobs are, how to get them. Additionally, again, I said, when they hear economic development or workforce development, a lot of these government agencies or public authorities or developers are talking about workforce training. The folks in Red Hook and Sunset Park have been hearing that a lot. A lot of the folks have done 6 or 7 different workforce trainings. What they really need is some sort of community benefit agreement that mandates some level of job. I think that's something that really needs to be said. Again, they are very, very nervous of being displaced. I think that's a huge challenge. The other challenge, I think, is that the way it's being communicated casually, they talk about access, transportation, job creation, commercial corridors. They don't actually talk about it being a working port, which could change people's perceptions of it. There's, increased pollution at ports and stuff like that. So I think, the biggest barrier for workforce is not just training, but also like communicating upward and downward to make sure those jobs are available, and then communicating what those jobs actually look like. There's, as you said earlier, it's the waterfront sort of the center of a system that can go into several different jobs. I'm not sure that's being properly communicated as well.
And Ray, what are your thoughts on the challenges of facing the sector?
Yeah, thanks, Joseph. And I really want to tie into this word communication and communicating that Matt just mentioned, because I think, part of the historic struggle, and I think it also ties in some of the points that Ryan was talking about with encroachment and just sharing linear feet of waterfront and how to use it, is us understanding and communicating and educating how important our waterfront and access is equally important, and communicate and educate on how important the industrial maritime sector is. And how can you find locations to have that mixed use, shared use port facility like on the North Shore of Staten Island, and also have a marshland and also have a kayak access, and make sure the community and economic development and jobs all happen in the same area. I think that long term, making sure people understand all of the resources, all of the assets, and all the benefits of the individual pieces, I think really help bring together a much clearer picture and better understanding and appreciation, quite honestly, about the value and the value proposition. And so access has a certain value proposition to certain constituents, as does jobs and a small location like Miller's Launch on Staten Island. Like, these are all incredibly important operations. Like, Miller's Launch is critical, as is Cadell's shipyard. Like, it's all very important, right? And so I think just understanding all of that, understanding how an evolution and how some changes could benefit. I will say one thing too, that we had a previous conversation about, is that over the course of time, when you find the degradation of our waterfront, it's incredibly expensive to maintain the waterfront. And that's why sometimes it falls in disrepair, because it's just so expensive to be able to do it, and find the time and the money and the procurement process to do it well is important. But I think over the time, the idea and the consensus was, if we take over an industrial maritime site, we must clean it and we must turn it into a park. And I think parks along the waterfront are incredibly valuable assets, and we should have them wherever we can. But I think in the vein of communication and education, we can also think about a cleaned up, greener, cleaner industrial maritime use that may not have the same kind of disturbances and pollutions to an area or to the groundwater or to the earth that it had in the past. And I think as you see electrification of ports, facilities, we'll get into this later in the webinar, but I think technology will take us to a place where that shared use concept that Ryan was alluding to, and the education and communication that Matt was asking for, I think come together.
I'll just add that that's a great plug for a report that Waterfront Alliance just completed and released at the end of last year. I'll ask one of the other Waterfront Alliance staff members to drop the link into the chat. We released a report on in public access on industrial sites and looked at some of the facilities globally that are kind of integrating. How do you create public space without really sacrificing the working waterfront? And make those work together. So we'll add that to the chat so that people can take a look at that. I want to make sure that we dive into the employment trends in a little more depth. And Matt, kind of how are employment trends shaping industry? And if you think about how the demand for maritime professionals has evolved over the past decade or so, what are the big factors really driving this change?
I mean, that's definitely a complex question. Some of the things that we've seen is that there has been a movement with the city to rebuild our infrastructure. There's the harbor plan that just came out that the mayor released that has about I think it's 50,000 roughly jobs that are either directly on the waterfront or tangentially to the waterfront. I think that's going to change the kind of individual that's interested in working there. They see opportunity. I think that it's also going to go to the workforce development organizations to sort of focus on different aspects of that. Like I said, the Ready Center not only does waterfront training, but we do EV training, we do battery storage, we do all of these things because there is this port modernization that I do believe will create different types of jobs, different folks who are looking for jobs. However, again, as I've said, there is still that concern. How specialized are these jobs, and are they coming to the community? I do believe that with the influx of investment, not only in modernizing ports and waterfront, it is also going to workforce development, that we will be prepared to do so.
Ray, do you want to maybe jump in and talk about the educational resources are out there, and also maybe the how offshore wind is kind of changing this?
Sure. I think it's important to understand some of the educational resources that are already existing in New York City and the creation of this pipeline. Some have been around for some time and some have been recently created. I think if you name 3 high schools, the Harbor School in Governor's Island, I think if you mention the McKee Technical School in Staten Island and the Urban Assembly School of Global Commerce in Manhattan, as well as SUNY Maritime, the nation's industrial merchant marine academy, King's College, not to mention so many of the other engineering schools, Manhattan College, and other places where people can get an education and work either directly in maritime or in one of the design firms, design services, and technical firms that support maritime. And then, there's a big push too for local content for the offshore wind industry, and that offshore local content means jobs and workforce development. There are multiple players in this space, from international recruiting firms to workforce development firms. There are specific and unique investments and programs that are happening from offshore wind companies and developers to try to create pipelines for jobs here. And so it's an evolving and growing sector.
I just
Go
want
ahead,
to
Matt.
interject really quickly. You definitely make great points about the investment in the merchant marine, SUNY Maritime. One thing I have noticed, though, again, I'm speaking on the humanities and the community front first, particularly people that live there, is that the biggest barrier isn't the ones that I've already mentioned. It's actually intimidation. So things like higher education, or I've used the word several times, modernization. That is a little antenna that goes up where, like, oh, this industry is not for me. I think that's going to be a major barrier as well, which again goes to the communication of there's other entry points, or these programs that are through CUNY and SUNY are actually like certification programs that you don't need a vast academic background to pursue. I do think that is, going back to all of it, is communication and being like very, very straightforward, direct information providing to individuals.
And if I could jump in, I think that's a great point, and thank you for that clarification. And it's one of the reasons why I started the conversation with Harbor School, McKee, and Urban Assembly, because there are so many students that go directly from the Harbor School and McKee directly into an apprenticeship program or some other program where they're working directly with a small maritime company in New York City. Not everyone is graduating from SUNY Maritime. There are many different opportunities and traditional apprenticeship programs that are happening throughout the city. And it really depends on what you'd like to do and what kind of career path you'd like to pursue. So I think there's something for everyone in this arena.
And Ryan, building on that, how do you see that playing in with the greening of the maritime sector? I mean, a lot of the funding nationally over the past couple of years is focused on electrification. There is a technology aspect that's becoming more and more prevalent. So how does that factor in with
certainly.
Ray and Matt's discussion?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as vessels modernize, sorry to use the word, Matt, and are potentially a bit greener and cleaner and less carbon intensive, just like we're seeing with trucks and automobiles, right? A lot of the equipment's completely different, and which requires a lot of different maintenance. And I think there could be opportunities to train folks to service, the vessels of the future, whatever those might look like. Obviously, we're quite a ways away from that. The Norwegians are making a big push for, electric vessels. We're not seeing that here yet, but that would certainly mean that we'd have to train folks to maintain those newer vessels. And so there could be an opportunity there as we transition some of this. And obviously there's big questions now with the change of administration, what the future of EV investments are. But I think, if the private sector can prove its worth, we may still see some of that investment. So I do see a lot of overlap between, workforce and sort of this EV transition.
That investments question was actually one of the first things that popped in the Q&A window. So we will come back to that. I do want to keep pulling on this thread around modernization, or whatever better word we come up for with it. But we're seeing lots of growth and innovation in the transportation shipping sectors, especially with advancement in technology and sustainability. Where do you see is the important place for the industry to go, whether it's on workforce, whether it's on finance? Ryan, why don't you start off, and then we'll go to the others.
Yeah, I mean, I do see a greater need for collaboration between, I think, the public and private sectors. A lot of times, stakeholders are working in their own silos, and I do feel that one place that we're seeing this is this expansion or growth of the Marine Highway Program, and that really needs and requires both the public sector, for example, to provide some land if it's available, and then separately the private sector to take that risk, right, which is what they do. And we're starting to see that, and those partnerships are really important, and hopefully we can see more of that. I also think that,
Ryan, can I
oh,
just interrupt and ask you to give just a 1 minute overview of the green or the marine highways or blue highways?
oh
Just
yeah,
so we kind of what
sorry
the
to jump into
concept
that.
is and kind of where it is in the development process.
Yeah. So this is an idea, we've been moving goods by water forever. This is actually no new idea. But obviously over time has, like I said, sort of gone away as trucking has replaced the movement of goods. Just although in New York Harbor we still have the cross harbor car float, which takes rail cars from New Jersey to Brooklyn. There is still a barge that moves containerized cargo from New Jersey to Red Hook. So we do see, goods moved by barge. The marine highways concept is just an effort to move more goods by water, almost agnostic of what the goods look like. I could spend a lot of time talking about what I think is most feasible, because, it's probably more challenging to move a container of cargo on a barge than simply, palletized cargo. When something's containerized, that does mean, that potentially ILA labor. So it could be not as easy to maybe move some things around the harbor quickly to start off with. So I think break bulk, and there's different, I could talk a lot about this. But it's this idea of, again, standing up this program to, reduce, pollution, to improve, highway congestion, really just to use our abundant waterways that we haven't been using as much. And so I think the city's been doing a good job at standing this up and working with the private sector and identifying sites that could be leveraged to move these barges, depending on time of day, perhaps. It could be a cargo bike on a barge. Like I said, it could be palletized cargo. There's lots of opportunity. It's just that the private sector needs to step up and also help, because, there are so many positive externalities associated with the program. It just requires, a bit of a leap of faith. Some parcel companies are looking at this and helping and trying to see if this is going to work, and it's great to see.
Ray, I want to push this question on growth and innovation, where you see the industry going to you.
Yeah, so I appreciate that. And to dovetail on what Ryan just said, some of the fastest innovation in electrification is in small vessels, small bikes, small cars, and there is some significant advancements in electric motors for vessels. These are vessels that are potentially more along the lines of a crew vessel, 40 feet or so, but we are seeing electrification both on the recreational side and the work vessels, but they're smaller. But to the last mile, we're seeing a lot of electrification. I think from a large container ship innovation perspective, we're seeing concepts of LNG gas propelling these ships. We're seeing hydrogen ships being produced, one in Norway. Ryan mentioned Norway before. Norway has a whole electric ferry system that cruises around the fjords, and they dock and charge when they land. It's incredible. I've been on them and seen them. What's happening now in some of the ro-ro ships is that they're putting fixed wing sails on some of the ro-ro ships, and they're thinking about sail freight and how sail and wind could help propel the vessels. So I think there's a lot of ways to think about how they change the paradigm on fuel consumption with the movement of vessels. And so I think, yeah, so Joseph is making a note here, row is roll on, roll off. That's cargo, so sorry about that. But yeah, there's a tremendous amount of innovation. Some things will be tougher to bring to New York and to the States based on regulations and things. I know we've struggled with bringing LNG. I know there's a couple of LNG cruise ships, I think, that are making it to the port right now. I'm not quite sure about that, but some of these things will take some time. But there are private industry designers thinking about this. And I think the future holds a lot of promise for some interesting innovations.
And one of the things that the city, to build on this, is one of the things that the city's been working on, albeit a little slower than some communities would like, is just ship to shore power. So oftentimes the vessels, even the really large one, the container ships, the cruise ships that are coming into the port are running their engines and spewing out the emissions from that pollutants into the neighborhood. Other ports plug the ship into shore power. It's the ship idles on electricity rather than its own engines, greatly reduces pollution in the neighborhoods. I see, Matt, I know you're shaking your head a lot. I know this is an issue that's important to you. And thinking particularly about workforce and marine highways and this conversation, where do you see the opportunities for growth and innovation?
Last mile, definitely. I think that's a very easy entry point for folks to experience some sort of job development. The way we're funded, mostly grant funded, there's a lot of elasticity to EV, working in EV, and being a delivery person counts as an EV job because you're going to be on an electrical micromobility vehicle. We see that there's a lot of potential for local hires through that. There's also just, as you said when we started this, there's going to be a tremendous amount of upland construction for these construction warehouse jobs for these marine highways that I think will be just a tremendous point. That's definitely the development that we're most excited about.
And then one final question before we jump to the audience questions. All four of us have talked about preserving the maritime industry for the future. How do we do that? Ryan, why don't you start?
Oh boy. I think that certainly building out and standing up the Marine Highway Program, I think makes a lot of sense. I don't see us necessarily cutting our congestion on our regional roadways anytime soon, and I think it'll only get worse. And so I think as time goes by, I think it'll become evident that marine highways make more and more sense. And I think that preserving these sites and allocating space for something like that is really important for the future and moving goods. I also think that these locations serve a sort of an emergency response purpose as well that doesn't get talked about a lot. After 9/11, people were evacuating Manhattan, on boats and vessels, and I think that it's important to have, particularly on geographic Long Island, a place like Red Hook or SBMT that is a large maritime industrial facility, because God forbid something happens, there's a place to go there. We can't solely rely on bridges and tunnels. I think it's important to have maritime assets for all these different types of reasons. And one other thing I want to mention is just, I guess, one way that we would be preserving this maritime activity is making sure that resiliency is really baked into a lot of what we're trying to do here, and make sure that our waterfront sites are resilient. And if they're operating, if pallets of cargo are moving across a marine highway barge landing, that it can withstand various climate events, that it's elevated to a certain elevation, that we've got the appropriate floodgates and flood walls designed, like what's going down at Esker, Eastside Coastal Resiliency. So there's a lot of things that I think we have to make sure we're integrating to support the maritime economy. But I do think marine highways is sort of the next evolution for the industry here.
And to just add to your emergency planning or emergency preparedness piece, that in COVID we had a hospital ship on the west side of Manhattan that was absolutely massive. PPE coming in through Brooklyn, Red Hook Container Terminal played a really key role there. So yeah, that speaks to that important need.
Mm-hmm.
Ray, do you want to go next?
Sure, that's great.
What do we do?
Such a great point that Ryan makes about other uses of our industrial maritime footprints. You know, because of the way these footprints have been designed, they're often heavy lift areas for specialized cargo that comes in. Con Ed and others have brought in by barge very large pieces of equipment to power their power generation plants and things. I would go back to part of my answer from earlier where I was talking about communication and education. I think getting people to understand the in-depth value of what these maritime centers provide for the community and how diverse they can be and how important they are, I think is important. I think the more we educate people on how critical they are, I think the more receptive they will be. And I think the stronger the future we'll see. I think that will also come into play when it comes to introducing a lot of new ideas around the Blue Highway and, you know, last mile distribution and electrification of all those things. I think all that ties in to this communication and education component and how these changes are going to take place at some of these facilities and how it's going to be for the betterment of the environment, of the community, strong components for economic development. Yeah, that's where I see it, and can't stress enough the diversity and importance of heavy lift, getting people out in emergency, a lot of things that these facilities provide that are often forgotten. I'll put a plug for the YouTube video called Boat Lift, the evacuation of Manhattan during 9/11. It's a powerful, powerful video. And if you haven't seen it and you do watch it, it will show you the incredible depth and diversity of the different types of vessels and people who are working and have worked in the waterfront. It's inspiring.
And then Matt, as we pivot to you for this, what do we do to preserve? Know that in the Q&A, there's a few questions specific to Brooklyn Marine Terminal, and just knowing that you are active in that area. You know, how are you thinking about how we preserve the industry for the future?
So I'm going to get a little abstract here, but I think, you know, to preserve the industry for the future, we have to make it kind of look like it did in the past, which is the people that live on the waterfront should be able to get a job on the waterfront. You know, I think this is a huge generalization, but I think there's a lot of native New Yorkers who are starting to feel like tourists within their own city. And I think that if there's, you know, we mentioned, you know, Norway's doing this. I used to work in wind for a long time. And, you know, there was skepticism that the first people to get big jobs in wind were going to be people from Norway, Belfast, and Oklahoma, and not the folks who live in these communities. I think that we really have to make sure that we're investing and communicating and informing folks, you know, that they are going to take priority with this economic development. We just use the word resiliency. You know, when Sandy hit, when Ida hit, you know, I live in Park Slope. We got, you know, fixed very quickly. Wall Street after Sandy got fixed very quickly. Red Hook took years to rebuild after Sandy. I think that the folks there really do feel like they're not, you know, the spotlight's not on them. And now that it is on, you know, it is on their community, is it really on elevating them? They've had to deal with the disinvestment and the pollution burden. Are they going to be able to get the economic development?
And then just from Waterfront Alliance's perspective, one of the things that's in our policy platform that we think this city very desperately needs is a comprehensive industrial land use policy to do an assessment of what are the needs of the industry, what's the inventory of the working waterfront now, what does supply and demand look like? Because there have been different planning studies. You know, there's a few designations within city planning. Port Authority did a port master plan a couple of years ago. Freight NYC and the Marine Highways and Harbors of the Future work all look at different elements, but there's not a kind of broad scale. What does the city and the region need? And then there are a few questions in the chat about, can Brooklyn or the industry support giving up space for 7,000 units of housing? That study is what we need to tell us if that's feasible or not. And we just haven't seen kind of the evidence that analysis of knowing what kind of space does the waterfront really need here, the working waterfront really need, has been done, and that's going to be a challenge that the city needs to address. One thing that there's a couple of questions that kind of pull on like the financing and how ports are paid for, and including both kind of how we compare to other ports in the country, and then just how do we revitalize and maintain infrastructure? Is that city? Is that state? Is that private? Is that federal? Is there one of you that wants to take that theme on?
I mean, I can speak a little bit. I can't speak fluently on this, but you know, obviously, you know, different terminals are operated in different ways. There's a model in which some ocean carriers actually own the land and operate a particular facility. You do see that in New Jersey, for example. You know, sometimes terminals are owned by pension funds. Some are operated, you know, I guess you could say the Port Authority, you know, has their way of doing it with some of the terminals that operate on their property. You know, I don't know if there is necessarily the ideal model, for example, but clearly, you know, it's incumbent to have a terminal operator or a stevedore that knows what they're doing, and can properly move cargo. But the models, I defer to the finance folks.
Can you maybe kind of define just for the group? So Port Authority is a landlord port. EDC is both landlord and for the cruise terminals, the operator. Can you just talk a little bit about what that actually means?
Yeah, I mean, I think with the Port Authority, you know, I don't know if others can speak better about the Port Authority, but they obviously contract with, you know, the ocean carriers to run various terminals in New Jersey, and with EDC more directly operating the cruise terminal. You know, I think there's just although it's Ports America really operating, so I don't know if it's completely different, but yeah, I probably should let others speak to it.
I would just say I think the Port Authority and EDC tend to be ground lease owners. And then the way the port is built out and the way the port is operated and how revenue is collected and things, I think, changes and the models vary slightly. But I think in general, the Port Authority owns the land and then they come up with a leasing agreement with the terminals and others. There are smaller facilities where they own the property themselves, and they then work on this in finding a way to be financially viable and maintain their facility and, you know, stay in good standings to keep them operational and functioning to be able to drive revenue.
And then just from kind of how those leases are typically structured, and there's lots of nuance here. So this is a massive oversimplification, but in general, the kind of major capital projects tend to fall on Port Authority or whoever the landowner is, and then the regular maintenance would be up to the terminals themselves. But when you talk about things like marine bores and the fact that these 70-year-old piers are not haven't been maintained for long periods of time and need kind of major rehabilitation, those lines of is this maintenance, is it rehabilitation, get really blurry. And then the landlord model where the port owns the land isn't uniformly true of all ports. There are other ports across the country that, like Georgia Port is a good example, another really large container operation. They actually operate all of the terminals themselves as the agency rather than contract out to a Ports America or one of the other one of the shipping companies. I think we've got probably time for one more question. I think, Matt, this one's probably best directed to you, but others can jump in. Who's doing a good job of making it so that maritime and waterfront jobs are accessible to the local communities, that those trainings, the training and opportunity feels real? Are there models in other cities, other industries of getting this right?
I'm not totally familiar with what other cities are doing. I can say that I've been impressed with New York City's commitment to job training. I think that a lot of folks are doing it right. I think EDC has made it, a priority, not just, all rank and file into the community, but also small businesses to sort of break into the industry. I started the offshore wind and waterfront pathways program for EDC. Joseph, you've been like a tremendous partner in that. They really have been very dedicated to making sure that the future of New York City's infrastructure is built by New Yorkers. As for who's doing a great job in placing, I have yet to actually see anybody really make that model of, making sure that it's built by New Yorkers and those jobs are going to people in the community.
Right. Any parting thoughts from the group?
I would try to answer a couple other questions here that are out there. I think looks like Andrew asked about the president's proposed suspensions. I think it's too early to tell yet with that executive order. I think there's a lot of confusion on what's a grant and what's a loan and what's going to shake out into individual federal agencies. I would say that the things that pertain to budget line items like the Army Corps and WERDA and dredging, that will likely not be terribly affected by this executive order. That's a line item budget item. And so agencies like the Army Corps and the Coast Guard and others have budget items to be that are dedicated to them. So that's, I think, important. There's another question about, can BMT be viable? They already were viable. And so they had a growing business and they were excited about the growing business. They were investing in electric trucks and expanding their footprint and trying to find new customers. So I think with improvements, they'll only continue to grow and continue to be a stronger, more viable business. There's a need, and I think there's a lot of people that want to use these facilities. So I think that seems fairly straightforward to me. I'm not seeing anything else.
I also do want to say BMT has done a good job of doing outreach. I'm on the advisory board there. They take what we say very, very seriously. They have politicians, community members, small businesses, all kind of communicating with them to make sure that it's viable and transparent.
Yeah.
All right, so we are at 12:59. I do want to give a plug for those who want to stay on this topic for the next hour. The Port Authority State of the Port is about to start at 1 o'clock. I'm dropping the link to that in the chat. They're live streaming it on YouTube. Now you've gotten the prep from us. Now go see what Port Authority is up to. I want to thank the panelists, Ray, Matt, Ryan. Great to see you guys again, and thank you so much for joining the discussion today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joseph, and thanks to Waterfront Alliance.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Take good care.
Have a great day. Thank you for joining, everybody.
Take care.